The sun was shining brightly on the bustling streets of downtown as Jake hurried out of his apartment, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He had a big interview today, one that could change the trajectory of his career, and he couldn't afford to be late. Fresh out of college and eager to prove himself, Jake believed this opportunity was his ticket to the top. Dressed in his best suit and armed with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance, he flagged down a ride to ensure he'd arrive at the office on time. When the car pulled up, Jake slid into the back seat, his mind already racing with thoughts about how he'd impress the hiring manager. His fingers tapped against his phone as he skimmed through potential answers to the standard interview questions, barely sparing a glance at the driver up front. The man behind the wheel greeted him politely, but Jake, too consumed by his own ambitions, dismissed it with a curt nod. The driver, a middle-aged black man named Marcus, had been driving for years to support his family while running his small business on the side. His demeanor was calm and composed, and his eyes reflected wisdom gained through life's ups and downs. Marcus had seen all kinds of passengers, rude, kind, indifferent, and had learned to take it all in stride. To him, driving wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to connect with people from all walks of life. But today was different. From the moment Jake stepped into the car, the energy felt off. His hurried tone and dismissive attitude was something Marcus had encountered before, yet he stayed professional. The tension began to build when Jake, in his impatience, muttered under his breath about the driver taking a slightly longer route to avoid traffic. "Figures," Jake said with a scoff. "This is what happens when you rely on someone who probably doesn't even know how to do their job right." Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He had heard comments like that before, but they always stung. He chose not to respond, focusing instead on the road ahead. But Jake, emboldened by his own sense of superiority, continued, "You know, maybe if you spent less time cruising around and more time learning a real skill, you wouldn't be stuck doing this." The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. Marcus remained silent, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Jake didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care, about the effect his words were having. He was too busy rehearsing his pitch for the interview, oblivious to the humanity of the person sitting just a few feet away from him. As the ride continued, Marcus's mind raced. He wasn't angry, at least not entirely. What he felt was disappointment, a familiar ache that came from being underestimated and disrespected based on assumptions. He had worked hard to build something meaningful in his life, and here was someone who couldn't see past the surface. But Marcus knew better than to let the moment define him. He had learned long ago that dignity came from within, not from the approval of others. When they finally arrived at the office building, Jake stepped out without so much as a thank you. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and walked through the revolving doors with his head held high. Marcus watched him go, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Shaking his head, he pulled away from the curve, heading toward his next ride. Upstairs, Jake was ushered into a sleek conference room where the interview panel awaited. The room exuded professionalism, with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city's skyline. Jake's nerves kicked in as he sat down, but he masked them with a confident smile. He was ready to dazzle them with his charm, intelligence, and ambition. When the door opened and the lead interviewer walked in, Jake's heart skipped a beat. His confident facade faltered as his eyes locked onto a familiar face. It was Marcus, the driver, now dressed in a tailored suit and carrying an air of authority that made Jake's earlier arrogance feel small and insignificant. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be the same man? And what did it mean for his chances at landing the job? His palms grew sweaty as Marcus took a seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Jake realized, with a sinking feeling, that this interview wasn't going to go the way he had planned. Marcus looked directly at Jake, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Shall we begin?" he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. Jake swallowed hard, suddenly aware that the power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. The story was far from over, but one thing was certain. Jake was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Jake sat frozen in his chair, his confident smile now replaced with a look of confusion and unease. Marcus, the man he had dismissed as just a driver only moments earlier, was sitting at the head of the table, exuding authority and professionalism. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how the tension would unfold. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together how this man could possibly be the one leading the interview. He felt a wave of panic as he replayed his behavior from the car ride. Every dismissive word, every condescending comment echoed in his mind, and he began to realize the gravity of his mistake. Marcus glanced down at the file in front of him, his expression calm but unreadable. He skimmed through Jake's resume, and Jake couldn't help but wonder if Marcus was deliberately dragging out the silence to make him squirm. The other panel members, seemingly unaware of the shared history between the two men, looked on with polite interest. Jake tried to compose himself, but his nerves were starting to get the better of him. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead. As Marcus began to speak, his tone was measured and professional, showing no hint of the encounter they had just shared. "So, Jake," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Jake's, "I see you've applied for the junior executive position. Tell us a little about what drew you to this role and why you think you're the right fit for our company." His words were straightforward, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Jake struggled to steady his breathing as he tried to formulate a response. Jake forced a smile, his voice trembling slightly as he began to answer. "Well, thank you for the opportunity," he stammered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I've always admired this company's commitment to innovation and excellence. I believe my skills and background align perfectly with the values your organization upholds." He paused, hoping his rehearsed answer would help him regain his footing. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was scrutinizing him more closely than the other panelists. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his face betraying no emotion. "Interesting," he said, flipping through the pages of Jake's resume. "You've certainly got an impressive educational background. But I'm curious, can you give us an example of a time when you faced a challenge and how you handled it?" The question was standard, but coming from Marcus, it felt like a test. Jake hesitated, his mind clouded by the memory of their earlier interaction. As Jake scrambled to come up with an answer, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was as if he was silently inviting Jake to confront the elephant in the room, to acknowledge what had transpired between them. But Jake wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. Instead, he launched into a story about a group project from college, hoping it would showcase his leadership skills and distract from the tension in the room. While Jake spoke, Marcus listened intently, his expression giving nothing away. The other panel members nodded along, seemingly satisfied with Jake's response. But Marcus remained silent, letting the pause linger long enough to make Jake shift uncomfortably in his seat. When Marcus finally spoke again, his question was pointed. "Leadership is important," he said, his tone even. "But how do you handle situations where your assumptions about others are challenged? How do you ensure that your first impressions don't cloud your judgment?" The question hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what Marcus was referring to, even if the other panelists didn't. For a moment, he considered addressing it directly, but fear and embarrassment held him back. Instead, he stumbled through a vague answer about open-mindedness and learning from experience. As the words left his mouth, he could tell they rang hollow, even to himself. Marcus's gaze didn't waver, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he moved on to the next question, maintaining the professional tone that made it impossible to tell what he was truly thinking. The rest of the interview proceeded in much the same way, with Jake doing his best to present himself as a capable and confident candidate while internally battling the growing weight of his earlier actions. By the time the interview concluded, Jake felt like he had run a marathon, his nerves frayed and his confidence shattered. As the panel thanked him for his time and stood to shake his hand, Marcus extended his hand last. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Jake thought he saw a flicker of something in Marcus' expression. Was it disappointment? Or perhaps it was something else, something more complicated. Jake couldn't tell, and before he could decipher it, Marcus turned to address the other panelists. Jake left the room feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the interview was over, but dread at the thought of what Marcus might say about him once he was gone. He replayed every moment of the car ride and the interview in his mind, kicking himself for his behavior and wishing he could take it all back. He had come into the day thinking he was in control, but now he felt like he was at the mercy of forces far beyond his understanding. As he stepped into the elevator, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this experience was far from over. The tension he felt wasn't just about whether or not he would get the job. It was about something deeper, something that had been shaken loose in him during his interactions with Marcus. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt uncertain about who he was and the kind of person he wanted to be. And as the elevator doors closed, he realized that the answers to those questions might determine more than just his career. They might determine the course of his entire life. Jake spent the rest of the day replaying the interview in his mind, unable to escape the gnawing sense of regret and unease. Every moment with Marcus, every word exchanged in the car, came rushing back to him like a haunting echo. He couldn't focus on anything else. His thoughts were consumed by the possibility that his careless comments had just sabotaged his career aspirations. The weight of his behavior hung heavy over him, and for the first time, he found himself questioning the way he saw the world and the people in it. That evening, Jake sat alone in his small apartment, staring blankly at his laptop. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through social media, but every cheerful post and career milestone shared by his peers only added to his growing anxiety. His stomach churned as he wondered if Marcus had already made his decision about him. Would the man dismiss him outright because of what had happened? Or would he use the interview process to teach Jake a lesson? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and for the first time, Jake felt powerless. Meanwhile, in a sleek office on the top floor of the company, Marcus sat at his desk, deep in thought. The events of the day had left him with his own set of questions and frustrations. He had encountered people like Jake before, people who made snap judgments without knowing the full story, who assumed they could look at someone and immediately determine their worth. But this time felt different. This time, Marcus had the power to make a decision that could challenge Jake's assumptions in a way that might truly resonate. Marcus stared out of the large window behind his desk, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He wasn't an overly vengeful man. He believed in second chances and the potential for people to change. But he also believed in accountability. As he thought back to Jake's awkward demeanor during the interview, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if the young man had already begun to understand the impact of his words. Perhaps there was a way to turn this situation into a learning opportunity for both of them. The next morning, Jake received an email from the company inviting him back for a second round of interviews. His heart leaped in his chest, a mix of relief and nervousness flooding over him. He hadn't been rejected outright, but he also knew this wasn't necessarily a good sign. The second round would likely be more intense, more scrutinizing, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus would be watching his every move. He spent the rest of the day preparing, poring over his resume, practicing his answers, and trying to psych himself up for what was to come. At the same time, Marcus was reaching out to colleagues and team members to set up the second round of interviews. He wanted to involve a broader panel this time, people who could provide different perspectives and insights into Jake's character and capabilities. Marcus knew that the way Jake handled himself in this next round would reveal a lot, not just about his qualifications for the job, but about his willingness to grow and adapt. When the day of the second interview arrived, Jake walked into the office building with a mix of determination and dread. He was greeted by a cheerful receptionist who handed him a visitor badge and directed him to the conference room. As he made his way down the hall, he couldn't help but feel the weight of every step, the tension building with each passing moment. When he entered the room, he saw Marcus sitting at the head of the table once again, flanked by a diverse panel of interviewers. The second round was grueling. The panel asked Jake tough questions about his past experiences, his problem-solving skills, and his ability to work under pressure. But what stood out most were the questions about teamwork and respect in the workplace. One interviewer asked Jake how he handled conflict with colleagues who had different backgrounds or perspectives, and another probed into his ability to navigate difficult interpersonal dynamics. As Jake answered, he found himself speaking more thoughtfully than he had in the first round. He talked about moments when he had misjudged situations in the past, and how those experiences had taught him the importance of empathy and understanding. Though he didn't explicitly reference his encounter with Marcus in the car, his words carried the weight of that experience. He was no longer trying to impress the panel with polished answers. He was speaking from a place of introspection and vulnerability. Marcus listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He could sense that Jake was beginning to grasp the lessons embedded in their interactions, but he wasn't ready to let the young man off the hook just yet. After the interview concluded, Marcus decided to have a one-on-one conversation with Jake to gauge his true intentions and see if his apparent growth was genuine. In the quiet of Marcus' office, the atmosphere was tense. Jake sat across from Marcus, feeling the full weight of the moment. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk in front of him, and looked Jake directly in the eyes. "Jake," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you and I both know that our first interaction didn't exactly get off to a great start. I'm not here to rehash what happened, but I need to know, what did you learn from that experience? How has it shaped the way you approach situations like this?" Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words. He knew this was his chance to come clean, to own up to his mistakes and show Marcus that he was capable of change. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Marcus, I won't pretend that I didn't mess up," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "When I got into your car that day, I made assumptions about you without even realizing it. I let my biases dictate how I treated you, and for that I'm truly sorry. It was a wake-up call for me, one that I needed. I've spent the past few days reflecting on how I can do better, not just in my career, but as a person." Marcus watched Jake carefully, his expression softening slightly as he listened. Jake continued, "I know words alone aren't enough to make up for what happened, but I want you to know that I'm committed to learning from this experience and making sure I never make someone feel the way I made you feel. If you're willing to give me a chance, I'll do everything I can to prove that I'm worth it." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Jake's words hanging in the air. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he considered Jake's response. Though the tension between them was far from resolved, Marcus could see that Jake's remorse was genuine. He decided that while forgiveness wouldn't come easily, there was value in giving someone the opportunity to grow. As Jake left Marcus' office that day, he felt a sense of relief and determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it with humility and an open mind. As Jake stepped out of Marcus' office, his heart pounded. The weight of their conversation lingered with every step he took down the long corridor. The sterile hum of the office seemed louder than usual, or maybe it was just his nerves amplifying every sound. He replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for signs. Had Marcus believed him? Had he said enough? Or too much? Jake couldn't tell. All he knew was that the next few days, or even hours, would determine the trajectory of his career and possibly his life. Jake returned home to his apartment and slumped onto the couch, staring at his phone. The email app mocked him with its silence. No notifications, no decisions, just a void of uncertainty. He'd been so close to a major opportunity, yet his own behavior had cast a shadow over it. The world outside his window seemed to go on as normal, cars honking in the distance, people walking by on the street below, oblivious to the internal storm he was weathering. For the first time, Jake felt the isolation of his own choices. The walls of his small apartment seemed to close in on him. Meanwhile, back at the office, Marcus was deep in thought. The rest of his team had shared their feedback about Jake's second-round interview, but Marcus remained undecided. On paper, Jake was qualified. His resume and answers had checked all the boxes. But Marcus wasn't just hiring for a position. He was looking for someone who could embody the values of the company, someone who could grow, learn, and lead with integrity. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city's skyline, his mind turning over Jake's words during their one-on-one conversation. He could sense sincerity in Jake's apology, but was it enough? Later that evening, Marcus decided to make a call. He reached out to one of his mentors, a retired executive who had once been in Marcus's position. The two spoke for over an hour, discussing the challenges of leadership, the importance of second chances, and the fine line between accountability and grace. By the end of the call, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The decision he was about to make wouldn't just impact Jake. It would send a message to everyone involved, from the company's leadership team to the interns just starting their careers. The next morning, Jake received a surprising email, an invitation to attend a company networking event that evening. It wasn't an official part of the interview process, but the note from the HR team emphasized the importance of building relationships with potential colleagues. Jake hesitated, wondering if this was a test. Was Marcus behind this? Was it a chance to prove himself or just another opportunity to fail? Jake decided he couldn't let fear dictate his choices. He RSVP'd with a simple yes and began preparing for the evening. When Jake arrived at the event, he was struck by how polished everything looked. The venue was a sleek rooftop lounge overlooking the city with soft lighting and an air of quiet sophistication. The crowd was a mix of employees, executives, and other candidates like himself. Jake grabbed a glass of water and scanned the room, unsure of where to start. He spotted Marcus almost immediately. The man's presence was commanding, even in a relaxed setting. Marcus was talking with a small group of people, laughing at something one of them said. Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Should he approach? Should he stay back and observe? The uncertainty was paralyzing. Before Jake could decide, someone from the group caught his eye and waved him over. It was one of the executives who had been on the interview panel earlier that week. Jake forced a smile and made his way over, his heart pounding with every step. As he joined the group, Marcus turned to face him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the rest of the room seemed to blur. Marcus's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, an unspoken challenge, perhaps, or maybe even a hint of curiosity. The conversation flowed around Jake, but he found it hard to focus. The group discussed company initiatives, upcoming projects, and the importance of fostering diversity in the workplace. The topic hit close to home, and Jake couldn't help but feel the irony of his presence in the discussion. At one point, Marcus asked a question that caught Jake off guard. "What does it mean to you to create an inclusive environment, Jake?" The room seemed to fall silent as all eyes turned to him. Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew this was more than just a casual question. It was a chance to prove himself, not just to Marcus, but to everyone there. Taking a deep breath, he answered, "For me, it means recognizing that everyone brings something unique to the table. It means checking our assumptions at the door and listening, really listening to each other. I've learned recently how easy it is to make snap judgments and how damaging that can be. Creating an inclusive environment starts with humility and a willingness to grow." Marcus didn't respond immediately, but his eyes lingered on Jake, as if weighing his words. The rest of the group nodded in agreement, and the conversation moved on, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was pivotal. He had laid himself bare in front of Marcus and his future colleagues, and now all he could do was wait to see how it would be received. As the evening wore on, Jake made an effort to mingle with other attendees. He met a young software engineer who shared stories about her first year at the company, an HR manager who offered tips on navigating corporate culture, and even a fellow candidate who was also vying for the same position. The more people Jake spoke to, the more he realized how much he wanted this opportunity, not just for the job itself, but for the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. By the end of the night, Jake felt both exhausted and exhilarated. As he left the event, he caught a glimpse of Marcus standing by the entrance, talking with another executive. Marcus glanced in his direction and gave a small nod, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It wasn't much, but it felt like a glimmer of hope. Jake walked away with a mix of emotions swirling inside him, knowing that the decision was now out of his hands. The suspense was almost unbearable, but he reminded himself that he had done everything he could to show Marcus who he truly was. Whether it was enough, only time would tell. The following morning, Jake awoke with an uneasy sense of anticipation. The weight of the previous night's networking event still lingered in his thoughts, but he was determined to keep moving forward. He reminded himself that he had been honest, vulnerable, and as genuine as possible. But as the hours passed with no word from the company, doubt began to creep in. Had he misread Marcus's nod? Was the event meant as an opportunity or just another reminder of how far he had to go to prove himself? Just as Jake was spiraling into another round of second-guessing, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the HR team. His heart leaped, but as he read the message, his excitement quickly turned to confusion. The email wasn't an offer or even a rejection. It was an invitation to return for an additional evaluation, something not mentioned in the original interview process. There was no further explanation, only instructions to report to the office the following day. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was unusual. Was this a good sign, or was he being set up for further scrutiny? Either way, he knew he had no choice but to show up and face whatever awaited him. The next day, Jake arrived at the office building with his nerves on edge. As he stepped into the elevator, he noticed another man already inside. The man was impeccably dressed, exuding confidence as he scrolled through his phone. Jake recognized him immediately. It was one of the other candidates he had met at the networking event. The man gave Jake a polite nod, but there was an air of detachment in his demeanor, as if he already considered himself the frontrunner. Jake's stomach tightened. Was this evaluation going to pit them against each other? The thought made his palms sweat. When Jake was escorted into the conference room, he was surprised to find not just Marcus and the HR manager, but several other senior executives seated around the table. At the center was a large screen displaying a series of charts and data. Marcus greeted him with a neutral expression and motioned for him to take a seat. Moments later, the other candidate walked in, his confidence still unshaken, and took the seat across from Jake. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the kind of tension that only grew thicker with each passing second. Marcus began to speak, his tone calm but commanding. He explained that this final stage was a collaborative problem-solving exercise designed to test not just their technical skills, but also their ability to work under pressure. Jake's heart sank. Collaboration? With a man who clearly saw him as competition. This was going to be a challenge. The task was laid out. They were to analyze the data on the screen, identify the key issues, and present a strategy to address them, all within an hour. As the timer began, Jake and the other candidate exchanged polite but strained introductions before diving into the task. The other man immediately took control, dominating the conversation and steering the analysis in his direction. Jake felt sidelined, his contributions dismissed or talked over. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. Instead, he focused on finding gaps in the other man's analysis, waiting for the right moment to speak up. About halfway through the exercise, Jake noticed something odd in the data, a pattern that the other candidate had overlooked. It wasn't obvious, but it could be significant. Jake hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. If he was wrong, it could make him look foolish. But if he was right, it could change the entire trajectory of their presentation. Summoning his courage, Jake spoke up, pointing out the pattern and explaining its potential implications. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to the screen. Even Marcus seemed intrigued. The other candidate quickly dismissed Jake's observation, brushing it off as insignificant. But Marcus didn't let it go so easily. He asked Jake to elaborate, pressing him for more details. Jake's nerves were on fire, but he managed to lay out his reasoning clearly and concisely. As he spoke, he noticed Marcus' expression shift ever so slightly, a flicker of approval, perhaps. The other candidate, meanwhile, looked visibly annoyed, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. The hour ended with both candidates presenting their findings. While the other man's analysis was polished and well-structured, it lacked the depth and originality of Jake's insights. Marcus and the executives listened intently, their faces unreadable as they took notes. When the presentations concluded, the candidates were thanked and escorted out of the room. Jake's nerves were shot, but he couldn't help feeling a glimmer of pride. For the first time in this grueling process, he felt like he had truly shown what he was capable of. But the day wasn't over. As Jake waited in the lobby, preparing to leave, Marcus appeared unexpectedly. "Jake," he said, his tone unreadable, "can I have a word with you in my office?" Jake's heart sank. This couldn't be good, could it? He followed Marcus upstairs, the silence between them stretching like a taut wire. When they reached the office, Marcus closed the door and gestured for Jake to sit. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Marcus began, his gaze steady. "You've shown a lot of growth throughout this process, and I've seen glimpses of the potential we value in our leaders. But there's one more thing I need to know before I make my decision." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "Why do you want this position? And don't give me the rehearsed answer. I want the truth." Jake froze. He hadn't prepared for this. The usual lines about career goals and professional development felt hollow now, inadequate in the face of Marcus's piercing question. Taking a deep breath, Jake decided to lay everything on the table. He spoke about his journey, his mistakes, and the lessons he had learned. He admitted his faults, including the incident in the car, and explained how it had opened his eyes to the kind of person he wanted to become, not just as a professional, but as a human being. By the time he finished, his throat was dry, and his palms were clammy. But he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you for your honesty, Jake. That's all I needed to hear for now." With that, he stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Jake left the office feeling drained but oddly at peace. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he knew he had given it everything he had. Back at home, Jake tried to distract himself, but the day's events played on a loop in his mind. As night fell, he received an unexpected text from Marcus. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Be ready." Jake stared at the message, his heart racing. What was waiting for him at 9 a.m.? And why did it feel like this was the moment everything had been building toward? The stakes had never been higher, and Jake knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The next morning, Jake arrived at the office feeling like he was walking into the unknown. Marcus's cryptic message had left him on edge all night, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this another test? A last-minute curveball? Or was it the moment of truth? Dressed in his best suit, he stepped into the building, his heart pounding. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile and directed him to the conference room, where he'd been told to wait. The room was empty, save for a small folder placed neatly on the table in front of the chair at the head of the table. Jake sat down cautiously, his eyes darting to the folder. His name was printed on it in bold letters. Before Jake could open the folder, the door opened, and Marcus walked in, followed by several senior executives, including the HR manager. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at Jake with a calm but serious expression. "Good morning, Jake," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Today is a final step in this process, and we have one last decision to make. But before we get into that, there's something you need to see." Marcus gestured toward the folder, and Jake hesitated before opening it. Inside was a document outlining the results of the collaborative exercise from the previous day. Jake scanned the pages, his breath catching as he saw the feedback. His insights had not only been accurate, but had led to a solution the team found both innovative and actionable. There, at the bottom of the page, was a single handwritten note. Potential for leadership, Marcus. Jake's eyes flicked up to meet Marcus's. You saw something yesterday, Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. Something not everyone else did. But there's more to being a leader than just skill or instinct. It's about character, resilience, and accountability. So, I have one final question for you, Jake. Are you ready to take on that responsibility? Before Jake could answer, the door opened again, and to his shock, the other candidate walked in. His presence threw Jake off completely. Was this another twist? The man took a seat on the opposite side of the table, his expression unreadable. Marcus turned to Jake, his voice calm but firm. You both bring something different to the table, but only one of you can lead this team. We need to be sure we're making the right decision. Jake's throat went dry. The room fell silent as Marcus pushed a button on the conference phone, and a recorded audio clip began to play. Jake froze as he recognized his own voice. It was the conversation from the car, the one where he had made those careless, thoughtless comments to the driver. Hearing it now, in this setting, was excruciating. His face flushed with shame as the clip ended, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus's gaze was piercing as he spoke. This was brought to my attention after the networking event, he said, his tone measured. It would have been easy to disqualify you on the spot, Jake, but I wanted to see how you handled adversity, how you grew from your mistakes. Jake could barely speak, his chest tightening as he struggled to find the right words. I made a terrible mistake, he finally said, his voice trembling. There's no excuse for what I said that day. It was wrong, and I spent every moment since then trying to be better, to understand the weight of my actions. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've learned that real change comes from acknowledging your failures and making them a turning point. The other candidate shifted in his seat, looking slightly uncomfortable as Jake spoke. Marcus, however, remained still, his expression unreadable. After a moment he nodded, as if he had heard what he needed to hear. Thank you for your honesty, he said quietly. Then, to Jake's astonishment, Marcus turned to the other candidate and asked, And what about you? Do you have anything you'd like to share about your conduct during this process? The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm not sure what you mean, he said, his tone defensive. Marcus didn't flinch. We've been observing both of you closely, he said, and while Jake's mistake was brought to light early, we've also seen signs of dismissiveness and a lack of collaboration on your part. Leadership isn't just about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about lifting others up, even when it's not convenient. The other candidate's confident demeanor began to crack, and Jake felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about his past mistakes. It was about who he had become and what he could bring to the table. Marcus stood, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. We've made our decision, he said. Jake, congratulations. The position is yours. Jake's breath caught as the words sank in. He couldn't believe it. After everything, he had been given a chance, not just to prove himself, but to make a real difference. As he shook hands with Marcus and the executives, he felt a surge of gratitude and determination. But just as he was about to leave, Marcus stopped him. One more thing, he said, his tone softer now. There's someone who wants to speak with you. Jake turned to see the driver from that fateful day standing in the doorway. His heart sank as their eyes met. He expected anger or resentment, but instead, the man gave him a small, knowing smile. Marcus told me everything, the driver said, stepping into the room. I wanted to see for myself if you'd really changed, and from what I've seen, I think you have. Don't waste this opportunity, Jake. Use it to do some good. Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left the building that day, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The experience had changed him, forcing him to confront not just his actions, but the person he wanted to be. And as he walked away, he knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would strive every day to be worthy of the second chance he had been given. As Jake walked out of the office building, the weight of everything that had happened began to sink in. The cool breeze hit his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to exhale. The whirlwind of the past few weeks, from the careless remarks in that car to sitting face to face with Marcus and hearing his own voice played back in that conference room, had left him emotionally drained. Yet, amidst the exhaustion, there was a newfound clarity. This was his chance, not just to prove himself professionally, but to grow into someone who could stand by his values and learn from his past. He thought back to the driver's words, the unexpected kindness in his tone, and the way he had looked Jake in the eye without bitterness or malice. That moment stuck with him, like a mirror reflecting the person Jake had been and the person he wanted to become. It wasn't just about being given the position, it was about what he would do with it. Jake knew the stakes. This wasn't just another job. This was an opportunity to shape a team, to foster collaboration, and to create an environment where everyone felt valued, no matter where they came from or what their role was. The next day, Jake walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. His first priority was meeting with the team he would now be leading. As he entered the room, he noticed a mix of expressions: curiosity, skepticism, and even a hint of excitement. He couldn't blame them for being cautious. After all, he was an outsider stepping into a leadership role, but Jake was determined to earn their trust, not through words alone, but through his actions. He started the meeting by introducing himself, not just as their new manager, but as someone who was still learning and growing. He spoke candidly about the importance of teamwork and respect, emphasizing that everyone's voice mattered. The room was silent at first, but as he spoke, he noticed a few nods and even a couple of tentative smiles. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't a full breakthrough, but it was a start. Jake knew building trust would take time, but he was ready for the challenge. Outside of work, Jake made an effort to reflect on the lessons he had learned. He began volunteering at a local community center, working with underprivileged youth to help them develop skills and confidence. It wasn't about trying to erase his past mistakes, but about channeling his energy into something meaningful. The work was humbling and rewarding, reminding him that real change required consistent effort. As weeks turned into months, Jake's team began to flourish under his leadership. He encouraged open dialogue and celebrated individual contributions, making sure everyone felt like they were part of something bigger. The team's performance improved, and so did morale. Jake's approach wasn't perfect. There were still challenges and setbacks, but he faced them head-on, listening and learning as he went. He often thought back to Marcus and the driver, whose belief in second chances had inspired him to keep pushing forward. One day, Jake received a call from Marcus. It had been a few months since their last conversation, and hearing his voice brought back memories of that pivotal meeting. "I've been hearing good things about you," Marcus said, his tone warm. "Your team speaks highly of you, and the results speak for themselves. I wanted to check in and see how you're feeling about everything." Jake hesitated for a moment, thinking about how far he had come. "I'm grateful," he finally said, "for the chance you gave me and for the lessons I've learned along the way. I won't pretend it's been easy, but it's been worth it. I'm trying to do right by the opportunity you gave me." Marcus chuckled softly. "That's good to hear, Jake. Just remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being accountable, staying curious, and never forgetting the people who help you along the way. Keep that in mind, and you'll do just fine." After the call ended, Jake felt a sense of pride and gratitude. He knew he still had a long way to go, but moments like this reminded him of why he had worked so hard to change. He wasn't just building a career, he was building a legacy of respect, integrity, and growth. Later that week, Jake was surprised to receive an invitation to a networking event hosted by the company. The memory of the last event he attended still lingered in his mind, but this time he felt different. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that room months ago. When he arrived, he was greeted warmly by colleagues and even some of the executives who had been in the conference room during his final interview. The atmosphere was welcoming, and Jake found himself enjoying the conversations and connections he was making. Toward the end of the evening, Jake spotted the driver, now a trusted colleague and someone Jake deeply respected. They exchanged a smile, and Jake walked over. "I've been meaning to thank you," Jake said, his voice sincere. "For everything. Your patience, your understanding. It meant more than you know." The driver nodded, his expression kind. "We all make mistakes, Jake. What matters is what we do after. You've shown that you're willing to learn and grow. That's all anyone can ask for." As they talked, Jake realized how much that simple act of forgiveness had shaped his journey. It wasn't just about being given a second chance. It was about earning it every day. The conversation left Jake feeling inspired and grounded, a reminder of how far he had come and the work that still lay ahead. In the years that followed, Jake continued to grow as a leader and as a person. His team thrived under his guidance, and he became known for fostering a culture of inclusivity and collaboration. The lessons he had learned from Marcus, the driver, and his own mistakes stayed with him, guiding him through every decision he made. Looking back, Jake could see how one careless moment had set off a chain of events that changed his life. It had been a humbling, challenging journey, but it had also been transformative. He had faced his shortcomings, embraced accountability, and committed to being better, not just for himself, but for the people around him. As Jake sat in his office one evening, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point, he felt a sense of peace. He knew he wasn't perfect, and he never would be, but he was trying, every day, to live up to the second chance he had been given, and in the end, that was what mattered most.